to share a little bit of my connection to Scotland and to AI in Scotland. I currently work as a physician lead for AWS or Amazon Web Services in the healthcare space, really using the power of cloud to help enable a lot of these new technologies, including AI. And I've been involved in AI within the NHS for the last 6 years through various different programs. So very excited for this conversation to really understand some of the perspectives of our panelists today who are thinking through some of these initiatives as the UK particularly and the NHS and Scotland are proactively rolling out and piloting and leading prospective studies in AI in many parts of the country. So let me hand over to Steph Wright, who's going to be facilitating and introducing you to the panel.
Please take off my mask. My mic should be on. Can you hear me, everyone? I'm quite loud anyway. So yes, welcome everyone. Thank you, Chris, for being the host of this room. The session today, hopefully a slide will come up soon, it's a discussion panel on the challenges of trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI in healthcare. Just to introduce myself a wee bit, so I'm Steph Wright. My job title is I'm the head of the Scottish AI Alliance Support Circle. Scottish AI Alliance, we're organizing this whole event today, which I hope you're enjoying so far. But as of, well, my other job title was the Director of Healthcare and Wellbeing Engagement for the Data Lab. So it's not entirely unrelated. So today with me, I have a fantastic panel in person, and we also have a panelist online, Anjali, who's joining us from London, but I believe we're having some audio issues with her attendance. So I'll leave her introduction till the end. But here with me in the room today, I have Professor David Lowe. David has many, many job titles. I honestly don't know when you sleep, David, but he's the clinical director of SHIP, which is the Scottish Health and Industry Partnership. He's also an emergency consultant at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. He's also the West of Scotland test bed lead, as well as the innovation lead. Like I said, I don't know when he sleeps, but we're very grateful for everything that he does. And he's a big champion of AI. So today he's here to give us a bit of a clinical perspective, but also he's been very involved with innovating with AI in the health service in Scotland. So welcome, David. Whoops, more people coming in. And then next to him, we have Jenny Brennan, who's a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So Jenny is a senior researcher, and she leads work on ethics and accountability in practice. Her research includes methods for inspecting and assessing algorithmic systems and the impact on people and society. Most recently, publishing the first case study on algorithmic impact assessments in healthcare with the NHS AI Lab. Jenny's come to join us today from London, so thank you very much for coming up, Jenny. The weather has stayed nice so far. We're getting snow later, everyone. So it's all good. All seasons in Scotland. And then last but not least, in person here, we have Dr. Chaz Nelson. He is the founder and CTO of Glyph AI. It's a company whose mission is to solve AI challenges to enable real-world solutions. Glyph AI offers MLOps tools so that teams can come together in one platform to embed knowledge into high-quality, auditable medical imaging data sets for building world-changing and trustworthy AI. Are we good to introduce Anjali? Yes, and then online with us, and also the slides, if we can make sure those change. We fantastic. We have. Hello, can you hear us, Anjali? Hello. Whoops, nope, the audio is still a challenge. You're echoing muchly, but let me introduce you while we try and work on that. So Dr. Anjali Mazumdar is the theme lead on AI and justice and human rights and the research chair for equality, diversity and inclusion at the Alan Turing Institute. So to any of you not familiar, the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute of Data Science and AI. They have a stand upstairs, so please go visit them. And so her work is at the intersection of algorithms and the law, where her interest is in actualizing the benefits and opportunities of data science and AI, whilst mitigating and balancing against its potential harms and risks in applications of justice, health, education, and finance. Anjali wrote a paper quite recently, co-authored a paper around whether AI means augmenting inequalities in healthcare. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to take here. So welcome to our panel. And hopefully Anjali's sound issues will be sorted soon. So that's a quick intro to everyone. So we're going to kick off with everyone kind of saying a few things, and then we'll dive straight into the Q&A because we're really keen to get questions from everyone. So, a question for Jenny to kick off with. What is an algorithmic impact assessment, and how can it make AI in healthcare more trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive?
Thanks, Steph. Am I clear to everyone? Fab. So an algorithmic impact assessment is a tool for considering the societal implications of a system before it's in use and hopefully ongoing. And they're first developed or proposed often in a public service, in a public sector context. For instance, Canada currently has one for use in its public services to really do a couple of things to help teams think about those implications and think about impacts, to help engage the public and wider communities in that consideration, and to create greater accountability and visibility around that thinking. So earlier this year, we at ADA, along with the NHS AI Lab, published the first case study considering whether this is applicable for healthcare. And it's a process specifically designed for use for teams developing AI for medical imaging as part of the data access process. So when we're talking about kind of ethical, inclusive, and trustworthy AI, what we're often thinking about is, first of all, how do we actually think about the ethical decisions that are being made? How do we make them explicit? How do we articulate them? And the trade-offs that we're making, and how do we facilitate teams in doing that? And then how do we include others in that decision? So it's not just the people with the power over the system thinking about those decisions and influencing those decisions. And then how do we create trustworthiness? How do we create an accountability relationship that helps ensure that those processes are happening and that gives people transparency and visibility over those processes? As part of our research, we talked to a lot of healthcare innovators, and we kind of saw a few things. One, they were really interested in having these ethical conversations. They thought they were really important, but they often didn't know how to do it on the ground, how to do it in practice. What does it look like to have that conversation with colleagues? What kinds of things should be on the list of considerations, and how do you weigh them up? And they were also interested in public and patient participation, as I'm sure many of you will be, but often found that was hard to resource, or they didn't have the in-house expertise, or the right access to patients in the public, or even individual team members might not feel they have a lever on how to prioritize that within a development process. And yet also at the same time, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, there's fears about duplication. There's already regulatory processes in place. How do we not duplicate those pieces and find something that's kind of supportive and collaborative? And so when we were thinking about this for healthcare, we were looking at a couple of activities as a result in an algorithmic impact assessment. One is this reflexive exercise, which is how you support that conversation within a team. So a team will work through a series of prompts and questions to think about a wide range of societal implications, from healthcare inequalities through to environmental impacts. And then that would go forward to a data access committee where it would be filtered down, and teams that were proceeding in the process would then take part in a participatory workshop, inviting patients and the public to deliberate on those impacts and inform those impacts, so that we're not just deciding what impacts are important, what impacts are amongst the same groups of people. That all feeds back into that template, and successful impact assessments would then be published, creating that visibility and transparency layer around like what impacts were considered early on in the process, and hopefully helping to build and earn trust. So the NHS AI Lab will be trialing that process, hopefully later this year. And we're really interested to see other trials, but we also recognise that algorithmic impact assessments are only one part of the story, and I'm really excited to hear the other parts of the story. They're only one part of the process. And they're still very early stage. We're still in needs of a lot more trials and exploration for how they work and how they work best to help ensure that trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI in healthcare.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jenny. In my excitement to get things going, I didn't actually introduce the session itself. I'm very sorry. But as you know, it's the challenges of trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI in healthcare. And our thinking behind when we curated this session was that healthcare is one of the sectors where there's so much potential for AI to make things better. But ultimately, the stakes are high and the margins for error are low when you're dealing with a person's health. So that's why we brought this panel together to bring together various perspectives in that. And also, I need to remind everyone, please submit questions through the online platform. There will be no roving mics. Everyone is to submit their questions through the platform. This is to make it as fair as possible for our virtual audience as well. So everyone uses the platform. It is Scottish AI Summit online.com. You will have all been sent your login yesterday. So brilliant. Sorry, interlude there. But next, I would like to ask David a question. The proposed solution for trustworthiness for AI in healthcare is usually around the concept of always having a human in the loop. What are the pros and cons of this from a clinical perspective?
Thanks, Seth. So I think the first thing to say is that probably to acknowledge on a journey that often for companies, they're very much thinking about the value in the target operating model to be able to describe the value of AI as being able to do automated reporting. If we think about examples in terms of chest X-ray auto reporting, or being able to take automated reporting out, or being able to look at lab results and not have to have clinical sign-off for them. Ultimately, some of the values around about efficiency and being able to describe how the clinician in the system can add value, and that's really talking about clinical decision support in its various different flavors. There's an understanding that if we take the imaging example, that might be as soft as a bounding box to suggest there might be a fracture there for a clinician to see, into examples that we've seen that are really positive around about thinking about how we use AI to support clinical decision making within the context of mammography, say. So the traditional system is you have two reporters that are humans, and you look at discrepancy. This is a really clear example of having an AI within the loop. It's not necessarily a closed loop, but it still has a clinical review component. You've got clinician and an AI taking out one of the human readers and then be able to look at the discrepancy between those with a third reader to be able to do that. If you take that further along that continuum, then you're starting to think about how you surface decision making to clinicians. So in my context, in the emergency department at 2 o'clock in the morning, how can you support a junior doctor at 2 o'clock in the morning? It's pretty challenged with somebody with chest pain and a whole range of symptoms, decide what test to do next, or indeed, can we just send them home safely? Now, they're probably not running a Bayesian probability at that or indeed at any time. The pre-test probability is based upon physiology and the story. So therefore, if you're going to surface AI to those individuals, a probability of admission versus discharge, or the need to do a biomarker test to look at myocardial infarction, then it needs to fit within their decision-making process as well. And how do you allow them to understand a probability and a confidence interval being surfaced by an AI? And be able to support their decision making around about that process. It can often be pretty challenging to do. So therefore, even when you're thinking about that kind of clinician in the system review component, you have to think almost at the impact assessment piece of how is that going to impact the clinician, and equally within a patient-centered approach, think about the complexity of that patient, that their pre-test probability from a clinician point of view is often based upon their past medical history, how they're presenting, and what time in the morning, etc., etc. If you take that simple example of admit versus discharge, if you push that towards the front door in the emergency department and the triage nurse saying, oh, we're going to discharge you, you're very low risk, actually just come back in the morning. It doesn't feel very comfortable at all. If you bring that into the clinical context and you're seeing somebody in an emergency department with that particular set of problems, then you're still being able to say, we're going to surface a prediction around about admission. It's going to be reviewed, but then what do you do about that? Critically, there's got to be an understanding that all of those, even a simple thing like admission versus discharge, is predicated on usual care, not optimal care, and certainly not optimal care for that patient. And that's really got to be thought within the context of how you're treating that patient. That's, for instance, somebody with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a debilitating progressive respiratory disease. If you're thinking about admission versus prediction, it's really hard to get somebody home in their 80s at 10 o'clock at night ambulance for 4 hours. So therefore, the data that's training that model is based upon usual care constricted by the context of the clinical situation you're in. That means that if you're thinking about open versus closed loop, which is really the question around about this, is how do you ensure, firstly, that it's appropriate, how you're surfacing that prediction? How do you retrain based upon optimal care that's not constricted by other environmental constraints? But ultimately, the advantage we are going to see with this are very much about supporting clinicians. So if you take the medtech example of diabetic control and closed loops for insulin or artificial pancreas as it starts to come, that's a really clear example of a closed loop system that benefits the patient. You empower the patient to be able to review how they're feeling. Is the glycemic control appropriate? Still for them to do their occasional own DMs, to be able to surface what's happening, but then be able to essentially be able to monitor the progress in terms of glycemic control and making sure that's tighter than it was previously if they were not in a closed loop system based upon insulin coming through on the basis of calories taken in, activity that they're doing, etc. So how do we do this well? Ultimately, I think it's taking really good examples like the mammography example or medtech examples that we can build confidence both for clinicians and for patients, and then think as we progress, because especially within the AI examples, the value and the business proposition for the medtech companies that we work with are often around the automated reporting, to be able to say your CT head's normal and not needed to be reported by a radiologist, freeing up time, to be able to strip out the 20,000 normal chest x-rays that we do of the 100,000 in the Queen Elizabeth and not get them reported so our radiologists can focus on reporting hyperacute stroke. But that stage in between of being able to triage or prioritise and the clinician being in the loop is really valuable because of actually patients are complex, and a prediction about osteoporosis, for instance, requires a contextual thought about what's going on with that patient. If they're predicted because they've got palliative lung cancer to die within the next 6 months, you probably shouldn't be putting them in for a clinic appointment, and it's really difficult for an AI to do that. So we want to be automated reporting or sending out invites for patients to pitch up for a DEXA scan when actually there's no value to the patient. So I think, as I said, we're on a journey, but I think we have to probably choose examples that engage clinicians, demonstrate value, safety within the regulatory process, and think about the wider impacts based upon the context that we are caring for those individuals.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. I have on my list to go to Anjali next, but can we? Okay. So, hello, Anjali. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Oh, hello. Ooh. Hey, great. Can we see?
Hello.
Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Brilliant. Welcome, Anjali. So I have a question for you. Can AI exacerbate inequalities? How can we mitigate this issue and make AI in healthcare inclusive and beneficial for all?
Can you, thank you very much, Steph. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can all hear you. I take it you can't see us, so we're just, everyone's got thumbs up.
Brilliant. You're just really tiny figures on my screen at the moment, but so hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you, Steph, for inviting me and the whole team. And I'm sorry to miss out on physically being present now that we are able to meet in person. But I would say this is an example of trying to be inclusive in this hybrid world. So getting back to Steph's very heavy question. We didn't start off light. I don't think there is a silver bullet to how we do this. And as Steph sort of phrased, and what I aim to look at is really this emerging nexus of AI and human rights, and where while often people think of AI and human rights as opposing or polar opposites, I tend to look at it as an opportunity for innovation rather than this risk of inescapable harm towards human rights. And the other question that I pose in terms of the development of AI technologies and is really, when we're talking about inclusion, is I often question why we're even having to talk about it. So what is the other opportunity there? Is not inclusion, which would just leave us with the bias systems that we tend to have. And so I think in talking about AI, and I use this term loosely, which I think we all are in this context, is really thinking about it in terms of data, the methods or the tools, and the systems in itself. And at the crux of all of this is the people, and that people, that the data is on people, but also the people developing these methods and tools and systems are people as well. So yes, in one of our papers with colleagues, it was very much thinking about the overall system and how biases come in and how that can not only exacerbate inequalities, but also where, and augment, but where we should be really thinking about the opportunities for us to intervene and intervene early. And I think some of our other, with other colleagues have looked at also is where are these inequalities stemming from historically? And so that's looking at not only why don't we have data on some people, to also the people building the systems having inequalities in that space as well. So really at the crux of all of this for me is inclusion. And so I often say, let's start with inclusion. So if you include people, whether that's from a data perspective or from a team perspective in developing this, or from the public having the opportunities to share what their needs are and what their concerns are, we have a much better chance at trying to design and develop systems that are really designed for people and really leaning towards what I think of optimal AI, which is really one that benefits all. So I'll start off with that, and maybe we can take it from there.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Anjali. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And then I'm going to move on to Chaz now. Last but not least, the question I have for you, Chaz, is AI technologies are increasingly open to medical device regulation. What is the impact on companies developing them?
Thanks. So the problem with going at the end of the panel and after the first keynote is everyone's already said everything I'm going to say. So I'm kind of recapping this from the point of view of a small company in the UK. So the first challenge is that regulations are geographically diverse. They're different all over the world, and sometimes they converge and sometimes they diverge. And so you have this problem of multiple things you're trying to satisfy. Then you also have the above and beyond. So as well as all the legal regulations, there's things like the impact assessments from the Ada Lovelace. There's lots of ethical frameworks. Professor Dignam was mentioning hundreds of guidelines on ethical AI. And that means you've got this massive forest of things that are mostly very similar, but sometimes very slightly different. And navigating that forest is a challenge. And then once you've navigated the forest and you've picked the right things, you've picked your geography, then you've got the challenge of time and cost. It costs a lot to go through regulatory processes. Just part of that being making sure you have all the evidence, part of that being making sure you've got the right advice. Particularly as a small company, you don't necessarily have an expert regulator or an expert auditor inside your company. And so this is a problem. And to summarize, to kind of highlight that as a problem, I was once talking to an investor about investment for medtech AI, and they said that the word regulation in a pitch deck was a red flag for them. It was enough for them to stop bothering that conversation. Now, I don't think this investor is true of all investors, but if investors who are investing in this next generation of tech are stepping back as soon as they hear the word regulation, then there's another problem. So that's all the negatives. But actually, I think right now, that landscape is changing and emerging a lot. So we in industry have the opportunity to embrace this. We have the opportunity to shape it in a way that combines what is needed to keep patients safe, what is needed to be ethical, inclusive, and trustworthy, with what is needed to actually build AI and build software. So the best data practices and the best software practices, and make sure that they align. It's a really interesting point that Jenny raised about we as companies and we as data geeks and software developers, we want to get involved in this, but we don't always know how. I think a lot of software developers will happily philosophize in the pub after work over a beer, but not necessarily when they're designing a button in the software or adding a layer to the neural network. So it's about how we practically implement some of these things inside our existing structures, like agile software development and things like this. And I think something that's been mentioned by, I think, everybody is this kind of idea of reinterpretation of this big forest of regulations and things out there. And I think as an industry, we need to start coming together, data industry, healthcare industry, academia, regulators, patients across the board, to try and bring some of this forest into as standardized or as easy to navigate a space as we can. Yeah, and I think that's my key point, kind of. There's lots out there. It's a bit of a challenge. We want to engage. We will engage. How do we navigate that? Probably by coming together.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Chaz. And now we're opening up for questions. I already have a great selection of questions here, so I get chair's prerogative. I'm going to choose one. Okay, I'll pick in one around how can AI be incorporated in healthcare while ensuring clinicians are empowered to overrule AI predictions without fear of professional repercussions? Over to David for that one.
I think the easy glib answer is we've already got decision support tools who use calculators to say you should do a D-dimer to look for pulmonary embolism, a clot in your lung, based on presentation, or I'm not going to do it, and some of these medical calculators are used for that. As with anything, it's documentation and making it defendable, the justifying. And as I previously said, sometimes the patient context, their comorbidities, their wishes, the context of the hospital you're working in, or the environment actually may change your approach, which is entirely appropriate. One of the key challenges is enabling the workforce, be it doctors, nurses, other healthcare workers, to be able to take that input from an AI, think about it, and be able to demonstrate why they're not doing that. Often, and I suppose when I'm teaching clinical decision support, it's about a corridor of acceptability. There's a baseline performance that's safe. And then anything you do above and beyond that is justifying why. So as an expert clinician, I hope that sometimes I will vary off the guideline because it's optimal for that patient, and that's okay. But I need to be cognizant of the risks of doing that, and sometimes document the risks of why I decided to go to scan before I intubated the patient, or whatever it happens to be. Ultimately, it's being able to, for each clinician, to be able to understand where they sit in a decision-making process. You use the word reflexivity, which is really important, and empower clinicians to be able to take that input from an AI as one aspect, not the only aspect. And when we get down to binary decision-making, which is often my world, it is demonstrating why you've chosen not to do a thing, or indeed why you have done a thing. And ultimately, the AI, because it's mostly binary, at that kind of point of surfacing it to the clinician, is demonstrating and justifying your stance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I hope that answered whoever asked that question. I have a question here specifically for Jenny. A question, Jenny, about algorithmic impact assessment. What can you learn from the life cycle of related impact assessments in healthcare? For example, the completion of equalities impact assessments, which sadly are often exercises in performing compliance rather than reflecting on and improving practice.
Yeah, that is a great question, and also something we want to be very conscious of. There's both kind of a precedence of impact assessments in healthcare, but also a precedence of impact assessments in other contexts, from policy to environmental impact assessments. And I think one of the challenges we've seen is that it can feel like a form that you have to fill in, as opposed to a process, as opposed to a kind of an activity that also contributes into your thinking and your development. And that's often understand, like in the context of a high pressure environment where it's another piece of paper, it's another a piece on the list. And so that's where I think our thinking really pushes towards how do you make it an activity, that initial reflexive workshop? How do you make it something that supports that discussion more than what, you know, the piece you fill in is the documentation of the thought and discussion, not the goal being to fill in a piece. And then the other piece is participation. I think a lot of impact assessment processes are often left to a single person who is tasked with responsibility over that checking that list or ticking that box. And I think there's a real opportunity to use that moment of impact assessment and say who actually gets to decide impacts and who gets to decide how we prioritize impacts and which ones we think about. And so that's what we've tried to do by incorporating public and patient participation in that step. And I'd love to see that tried in other forms of impact assessment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then we have a question here that I'm going to pose to Anjali. What are some good practices in engaging the public around the complexity of algorithms and algorithm systems work, and the social implications could be so difficult to fully comprehend and explain whilst evidence is still emerging? The reason I'm asking, obviously, Alan Turing Institute have a big mission around this. And in fact, we at the Scottish AI Alliance are working with the Alan Turing Institute on a public engagement thing around AI. But it'd be great if you could comment on that question.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that there's been much work to try and engage the public in more, well, particularly over the last couple of years on some of these issues. There have been citizen juries, of which, of course, Ada Lovelace and other colleagues have really pushed to try and engage the public. I think one of the challenges we find is, again, how best to engage the public in a timely manner and at various stages throughout the process. So I think there's been a tendency to either engage at the very beginning or near the end of a product development with very little communication throughout. And so that's one of, I think, both the challenges and the opportunities that we really need to think about of how we can do that. The other bit, of course, goes down to even what we talked about in terms of how to best design some of these AI tools in terms of data representativeness. And that goes to the same thing in terms of engaging with the public, is how can we engage and ensure that we're not just engaging with the same group of people, but as close to a representative or larger group of people that can represent people that are both either from an accessibility point of view or those that have various concerns, whether this is from a geographical perspective, whether this is from a privacy data concern, or how the technology may be used. So I think that and this goes back to there's going to need to be, for lack of a better term, boots on the ground engagement that's required in order to try and get a more inclusive and engaged process.
That's great. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chaz. We have a question here. Might it not be that precision regulation, where necessary, is a better answer than generalized regulation as a reaction?
I think that's a great idea from the point of view of a company. I think lots and lots of SMEs in the health tech space in the UK would be very happy if they thought there was a way they could do things without regulating it. And sometimes you do see companies start out with the process of providing what's going to be an AI medical device, and it's going to do something diagnostic, and kind of downgrading it in what it actually does to escape regulation. This is a real thing. So from the point of view of a company, I think precision regulation on things that need to be regulated is great. I guess the initial response to that would be like, from the regulator's point of view, that then becomes hard. And also, like, you then end up with, there's already kind of gray spaces about what is and isn't a medical device, and we have rules that try and keep that as clear and as crisp as possible. But if we start having kind of precision regulation on very specific things, I feel like there'll be an ever increasing gray space, because you'll just add additional boundaries. So I like the idea because it would make my life easier, but I'm not sure it's the right idea.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got some fantastic questions coming in, and some of them are pretty heavy. So I'm going to see if anyone wants to tackle some of them. So let's see. Someone sent something in with a quote. They have a link to the quote, but I can't click on it, so I don't know where that quote comes from. But the quote is, "Everybody's problem becomes nobody's responsibility." Where does the responsibility for making AI trustworthy and inclusive sit? This is obviously a much broader, question, but it'd be really interesting to hear perspectives in the context of this panel. So let's go to Anjali first.
There isn't a single non-heavy question there that's been posed. I think this is one that we've all been grappling with in terms of responsibility, accountability, and I personally, and this is still evolving, is that I'm not sure that there is one place that it can just sit at the moment, at least not at the moment, especially where we have potentially public data that's been collected by our public healthcare systems to private commercial organizations that are working on either developing the tools to harness it, which means that there needs to be some accountability through that public and private partnership, let alone any type of regulatory body. We also need to consider the fact that depending on the type of tool that we're talking about, if it's machine learning, that depending, there may be drift. This needs to be monitored, right? So who's responsible? Is it, if it's being, utilized by the NHS system, but it has been developed by a private company, the tool itself? Where's the accountability and where is joint accountability required? So that was less of a solution and more questions, but I think these are the important things that we need to still be thinking about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And David would like to come in next on that.
Yeah, I think ultimately that a healthcare provider is going to buy a product and deploy a product and enable their clinicians to use that. The boards, if we take Scotland's example, or indeed the UK's example, do not have the resources at present and probably ever to be able to do that. There's clearly regulatory ticks around being able to demonstrate that they've got a C mark or they've appropriate impact assessments, EQIAs, and gone through the menu of things that should be done. The drift question is really important. We're seeing a drift of 10% when we deploy one solution from one board to another at the moment. And that raises a question about post-C marking surveillance, but actually for each board, there's going to be a requirement to test performance and monitor that performance. And how do we do that? So then in Scotland, the AI Hub programme for government that Katie Forbes mentioned is really about providing that consultancy service, which in NHS England, that's going to be NHSX doing. They'll provide the regulatory support to make sure the C mark is fit for purpose for what it's going to be deployed for. There's clearly going to be a responsibility to enable the workforce to use it in an appropriate way, recognising there'll be drift in its utility, and be able to monitor that, educate and respond to the challenges around about those aspects. And that really kind of speaks to the kind of co-design component. As you're developing that technology, if you're engaging with clinicians, patients to understand how it's going to be deployed and its use case within patient flow and clinical flow is really important. And that kind of takes us to that kind of phenomenological needs to understand how decision making happens. And that's going to drive how we choose which products we buy from a vendor and how we actually choose to deploy them. And I think it's going to be a core requirement for governments to provide the resources to support it. Because ultimately, the problem within Scotland and other places in the world it's larger healthcare systems providers will be able to adopt. But what does that do for the Highlands and Islands in Scotland? And one of the key principles is the quality of access, as well as recognising there's an opportunity to engage early. If you've got a large health board with a whole bunch of academic radiologists that are going to engage in developing that technology.
Brilliant, thank you.
I have
Chaz?
a thought or two on that from the industry point of view. So I think AI in healthcare is often lumped in the medical devices space, but I actually think it's a bit more like a drug. It's almost a little bit more of a consumable thing. So you have the regulatory process that you go through when you build this, same as with a new drug, and you do. But then a company goes away and makes that drug for your healthcare provider and sells it to them, or it sells it to Boots or whatever. And that company does constant quality assurance. In the case of an AI, the company providing the final software that's being used is essentially doing the same job, and drift comes under that kind of quality assurance thing, I think. So the responsibility is spread along the whole pipeline. Like for drug discovery, the responsibility is with the pharmaceutical company, with the manufacturer, with the healthcare provider, and with the patient themselves throughout. And I think the same is true with AI, but we have to bear in mind that AI is not like a traditional medical device. It's not like an MRI machine where you put it in the hospital, and as long as you do your kind of like quality assurance test once a month, it's fine. It has to be more quality assurance at the level of industry, at the level of the manufacturer.
Brilliant, thank you. Jenny, anything to add? Or should I? Or maybe find a slightly less heavy question, I'm not sure. This is a question around. I saw that you're not able to help in the fight against COVID, although the government projects. Debatable perhaps speak on that, but the main issue was that AI approaches have been developed in the past using simulated data rather than real-world data. Also not entirely so many issues with real-world data we're not know. This is the important question. How can we enable AI researchers to access health data so that we can start identifying and solving issues and challenges related to AI for healthcare? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I suppose the Scottish piece would be, as Albert said earlier, is trusted research environments to do that, so either Research Data Scotland or the Safe Havens, and be able to create that environment to be able to put data into with various levels of anonymisation, pseudo-anonymisation, to enable individuals or companies to access that data with the appropriate controls and contracts in place. I think we're increasingly moving to the space, as a number of people undoubtedly say, of data in cloud, clinical data repositories, and how do we map and transact that data to support the deployment of AI, and be able to, pertinent to the previous point around about its performance, and how do we understand, log, and see the drift, because that's a critical piece. If you look at the AI and think that's nonsense, how do you record that you think it's nonsense, and how do you make sure that that ground truth, if it is indeed nonsense, goes back to inform performance of that system. So I think it absolutely is about making it available. The question is, what are you doing? Are you training, deploying, testing, validating, and where do you sit within that journey? And therefore, what quality of data do you need to be able to do that thing? And often the request from data science companies or AI companies is, we want all the data
Unanonymized.
in our tin resource somewhere else. Increasingly that's not the case. We're thinking about cloud and how do we transact data that way. But again, it's where do you sit in the continuum from, I've got a great idea, I want some data to train, versus I've got deployable AI. And some of the work that we do within the test beds within Scotland is engaging, doing that triple helix of academia, the NHS, and industry, and creating that environment, which some of that is the trusted research environment, to be able to allow the training deployment of those solutions, either using AWS, Azure, or whatever cloud-based environment. But I think that healthcare providers and the NHS need to get into that space of how do we provide data safely against our priorities for the solutions that we need, that we're going to buy, that are going to change the delivery of healthcare for our patients.
Can I also come in on that? Because I think I was interested in also the kind of higher level framing of this question around AI and the pandemic, and maybe this sense of disappointment that maybe AI didn't rush to the rescue as people might hope. And I think that really comes back to this question of kind of when is AI appropriate and what are we developing it for? and what we have experience and appropriateness in developing it for. I don't think it's surprising that we took a new, I think it's right to try things in an emergency situation, but we are not used to deploying AI for emergencies. That's not the process or the scenario that we were previously developing AI systems in healthcare for, or in other healthcare, and it would be fascinating to have people specifically working on AI for pandemic response in future. But I don't think that's something that comes as a shock, but also thinking about what we would need as infrastructure to think about those kind of problems in future. Colleagues of mine produced a report with the Health Foundation on the data divide, and they found that the majority of those less likely to have benefited from data-driven and digital interventions during the pandemic were not only from minority groups, but from lower income backgrounds or the elderly. So inequalities were exacerbated for those individuals who sat at the intersections of vulnerabilities. And that's something that we actually currently find very hard to identify or factor into AI development. I think, for instance, there's this great quote that 13% of the respondents in surveys reported they did not have a smartphone, but were also at high risk of COVID-19. Now, if you think about a lot of the interventions that looked at more data-driven approaches, from contact tracing apps to the assumption that there was a smartphone involved often rings true. And so I think thinking about how we both what skills and capacity we have within AI development upfront, and what applications we have experience in, but also how, if we wanted to build future resilience and future appropriateness for that, what kind of inputs we would need to do that in an inclusive way.
Great. Thank you very much. We have 9 more minutes. We have a whole lot of questions. So I'm going to try and combine a few of them. Just to follow on something you touched on there, there's multiple questions around bias. So I'm going to combine them all together and then see who wants to take them. So one question's around, how can we highlight the bias of practitioners and those who build these systems, especially towards marginalized groups? An example case is high mortality rates of Black women in childbirth due to a mix of errors from practitioners, but also prediction mechanisms that are built on biased data. And related to that, another question, how do we ensure that AI-driven services do not embed existing exclusions and bias or cherry pick some use cases at the expense of others? Yeah, so I think that's a good combination of questions there. Anyone want to take it? Njali? Oh, have we lost her? She's kind of frozen on the screen. Okay. 2 people in the room. Anyone want to take that one on? She's back.
Sorry, we can see Anjali down here, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, in case you're wondering why we're pointing to the floor.
Brilliant big screen.
So I think the bias question is a really good one. I think ultimately the challenge is that even the population within Scotland looks very different from the population in our city, London, and we've got to understand where those solutions were trained, developed, and then ultimately that kind of retraining component. Again, it comes down to how you surface that information to a clinician. Is that a closed loop phenomenon? You just do this thing? And I think, as we suggested, we're not at that level of maturity in very many systems to be able to just simply put a prediction that makes a thing magically happen. So therefore, I think some of it is trust in our healthcare workers, that they work within biases and they need to know them. Pat Crosscarry's published the 33 biases that clinicians generally operate, be anchoring bias, selection bias. We have to recognise that actually bias exists in our decision making as is. Part of it is being able to demonstrate where that AI has come from and how do we actually allow clinicians to have that critical thinking about being able to say, well, this chest X-ray solution was trained in data from Kaiser Permanente, which is an insured bunch of people in California. What does that mean in terms of it being deploying it within Glasgow or within a population that have got a higher rate of sarcoid, for instance? And that's going to be really difficult to do, apart from if we actually enable clinicians, healthcare workers, to critically think about the provenance of that data and the quality of it. And that almost goes back to the kind of COVID question. We know that a lateral flow test is not particularly accurate at performance. We know that a PCR test is better, but we still know there's an error rate inherent within it, and therefore that bit of information that says this person's COVID negative, are they? If they've got a COVID-looking chest X-ray and they've got all the symptoms, we're in a pandemic. The probability of COVID in the test is not performing either because of sampling or whatever component of it. So therefore, it's behoving the clinician to take that bit of evidence and go, actually, benefit versus risk is, I'm going to give this person some steroids, because that's the thing we do for those individuals. And I think that's really important to recognise that complexity. And ultimately, it's going to be the clinician that we're going to have to empower and train to be able to take that bit of information and understand the context of which it's developed. And that's really difficult to do, because ultimately the PCR test comes back as negative. You go, well, you don't have COVID, do you? So that's probably my input from that.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to combine two more questions. One that's probably aimed at Chaz, but everyone, specifically around regulation. What is it? How can we best communicate the value of regulatory interventions as helping to build better, safer, higher quality products? And regulation protects companies as well as constrains them. What are the issues that make companies reluctant to enter a regulated health AI market?
Great questions. What makes companies reluctant is largely time and money. I think a lot of AI at the moment is being done still in very small companies. They have a limited amount of money and they want to make it last as long as possible. Particularly, as I say, the sexier your AI, quote unquote, the more money you're likely to get. So brain tumors, great. But something a bit more subtle, like a dermatology test or something, is actually harder. It depends how well you play it to get the money. So you've got limited money, you've got limited time, you've got limited resources, you don't have in-house experts. All of these things cause a reluctance for smaller companies in particular to engage with that process. I think at heart, they all want to engage and they do understand the benefit, they do understand that it's protection for them and it makes them do the right things and they get a better product out of it. But it's just kind of trying to match the kind of what they would like to do in an ideal world and what the bank balance says in a lot of cases, I think.
That's great. Thank you very much. Like I said, we can't answer all the questions. There's a question around explainability. Just to highlight to whoever asked that, we'll be having a session around explainable AI later today. In fact, a lot of the questions touch on topics that will be discussed throughout the day in various sessions. So there's that. And then let's see. How about I will close with a question to each one of you for a take. What is the biggest hurdle you see for the widespread ethical adoption of AI in healthcare? I will go reverse because we lost Anjali for a second, so we'll start with Anjali and then come back to the people in the room.
I guess I would say trust. Leave that with a big question or a heavy note on there is trust, and at the heart of trust, I think, is inclusive and inclusive design and transparency around it.
Thank you very much. And then over to Chaz.
I would say trust.
Okay.
But I think it's not just the trust that Anjali's on about, but also trust of patients and doctors in the AIs they're using, companies in the regulatory schemes and the ethical frameworks that they're using, and kind of all the players involved. I think there's still a bit of concern about where this will go and how it will grow, and trust is a really big part of that. So,
thank you. And over to Jenny.
I think some of those ones are actually trying to genuinely answer the question. It's quite hard. I think for me it comes back to this issue of choices and who choices benefit and how we articulate those choices. And I think having structures to help articulate those choices and help make that a transparent and accountable process to build that trust is something that I think, I think that's more than one hurdle in one, but.
Brilliant, thank you. And on to David for the final hurdle.
I think it's demonstration of benefits. I think there's definitely a trust component of that, but it's actually being able to say to a group of clinicians, especially in the current climes, we're going to ask you to do something differently. And therefore it's beholden on academics, the industry partners, to be able to demonstrate how does this improve patient, clinical and economic outcomes, which actually is going to be a driver for adoption. And I think that's ultimately we have to, if you tick all the regulatory trust components of it, is ultimately why should we engage? What's this going to do for us, for our patients, for our healthcare system? And that bit, I still think is quite challenging when you look at value propositions from companies is, okay, is this cost? What's this going to do? And what's the cost of us for adopting this particular technology? And how do you draw a line to benefit from that? And that's not beautifully done often at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So some of that trust squared, choices and who they affect and who makes them, and demonstration of benefits or doing it better. So I'm going to bring this to a close and thank my wonderful panelists. Sorry, Anjali, for any tech issues, but we're delighted you could join us today. So thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Chaz, Jenny, and David. Thank you to the audience for all the fantastic questions. Once again, really sorry we couldn't answer them all, but you know, there's the chat function on the platform. Please chat away to all your fellow delegates. We hopefully have around 800 people on there, so chat away. There's many conversations to be had. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this session. I'm going to pass you back to our room host, Chris. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It was a very engaging conversation, clearly similar to many of the discussions that are happening in the healthcare world around the globe, too. So thank you, Steph, and thank you for the panelists, and we hope you enjoy the rest of today's event.
Room selfie, everybody. Hey! Thank you. To the next sessions. The next session in here is the open data session, so please stay in here if that's where you wish to go. Next door is AI and education. Upstairs is responsible innovation. Thank you.